Photons strike asphalt shingles. Kinetic energy transfers. The solar radiation ceased 5 hours ago. 00 am. Total atmospheric darkness. Yet, the ambient temperature of your upper-level habitation chamber exceeds the solar peak of noon. The mechanical cooling apparatus grinds. A localized thermodynamic cycle. A compressor fighting an infinite heat sink. Acoustic vibrations penetrate the structural framing. The compressor engages. The thermal mass remains saturated. You calculate the capital expenditure of this kinetic exchange. You isolate the blame on the compressor. The compressor is innocent. The compressor is irrelevant. 3 meters above your cranium. Sealed within an unventilated architectural void. A static volume of air sits at 140 degrees Fahrenheit. A thermal battery. It discharges. It transfers radiant heat downward, through the gypsum, through the fiberglass, onto your epidermis, all night long. The Journal of Applied Physiology confirms this parameter. Ambient thermal loads exceeding 75 degrees Fahrenheit suppress melatonin synthesis. They disrupt the circadian baseline. They degrade the biological architecture. Your cooling apparatus does not cool the structure. It battles the architectural envelope. You finance this friction. Every billing cycle, every summer month. Here is the structural failure omitted from modern discourse. A bimetallic switch exists, 30 millimeters in diameter, $12 at any localized supply depot. It terminates the thermal war. Install the circuit. It mechanically extracts the static furnace from your architectural void. Autonomously. The compressor ceases its entropic overexertion. It stops fighting a thermodynamic mismatch it was never engineered to resolve. This is not novel engineering. This holds no proprietary patents. The thermodynamic principles predate the establishment of the American Republic. In one precise architectural execution, this protocol eradicated a structural thermal load by 90%. Why is this bimetallic trigger absent from your structural envelope? Why is a $12 component extracted from an architectural asset valued at $300,000? Why did the climatization cartel dedicate 50 years of behavioral engineering to ensure you authorize a credit vehicle rather than apply a torque driver? I will dictate the precise geometry of this switch, the physical laws governing its operation, the mechanical protocol to integrate this thermal bypass system within a 48-hour rotational period, utilizing mechanical levers currently degrading in your storage bay. 0 municipal authorization. 0 contracted labor. This protocol applies universally to a structure fabricated 365 days ago, to a structure erected in 1960. Maintain visual lock. The bimetallic switch is merely the primary phase of a tripartite thermal defense. The tertiary phase is the variable the climatization cartel actively suppresses. It is the specific architectural failure that converts standard atmospheric extractors into parasitic vacuums, vacuums that inflate your capital expenditure. We isolate the origin of this protocol, not within a sterilized laboratory, not within a commercial showroom. The origin is an agrarian structure in the high albedo zones of northern Indiana, the Amish territory of Shipshewana. The biological entity was Mo Hochstedler, an organism exceeding 70 solar orbits. Grip strength equivalent to structural timber. Late July. The regional atmosphere is stagnant. High relative humidity. A suffocating thermal blanket pinning biological forms to the substrate. I breached the threshold of his structure, expecting severe metabolic distress. 0 distress detected. The interior ambient temperature measured exactly 15 degrees Fahrenheit below the exterior structural envelope. 0 acoustic signature of a mechanical compressor. 0 compression cycle existed. Hochstedler initiated a vertical ascent to the apex of the structure. He indicated a rudimentary timber housing at the absolute peak of the roofing plane, fitted with precisely angled louvers. Behind the louvers, a low-velocity rotary extractor. It utilized 0 alternating current. It operated via a photovoltaic surface clamped to the high-exposure gable, regulated by a micro-switch spliced into the direct current line. I interrogated the mechanical principles. He avoided thermodynamic nomenclature. He stated an absolute physical law. A structure must be permitted to expel the solar radiation of the day. Modern architecture is engineered to trap it. That acoustic sequence is the definitive thesis. To comprehend how timber louvers and a 30 mm bimetallic switch neutralize a $10,000 compressor system, we must reverse the timeline. TRAS, zero solar orbits. Into a high albedo silica environment engineered for biological termination. This thermodynamic bypass did not originate in the American agrarian zones. It originated with biological entities possessing zero mechanical leverage. Existing under a solar radiation source engineered to induce lethal hyperthermia. Rewind to ancient Egypt. The high-density masonry settlements bordering the Nile River. 3,000 orbits past. The solar maximum is biologically devastating. These entities possessed zero electrical infrastructure, zero chemical refrigeration. They possessed exclusively saturated soil, structural clay, and neurological adaptation. They integrated a pneumatic funnel into the upper structural boundary, designated the Malcaf, a vertical intake scoop ascending above the thermal boundary layer, oriented precisely toward the predominant atmospheric currents. It captured the high-velocity, low-temperature atmospheric strata. It forced the air mass downward into the biological habitation zones. As the high-pressure cool mass entered the lower boundary, the low-pressure, high-temperature, carbon dioxide-saturated mass accumulating at the structural apex was violently displaced. Upward, outward, expelled. The architecture possessed an inhalation valve. The architecture possessed an exhalation valve. A mechanical respiratory system. Pigment analyses on subterranean mausoleums from this epoch verify these funnels on elite structures. They possessed absolute comprehension 3,000 years ago. You do not combat thermal kinetic energy. You construct an exit vector. You permit the entropy to disperse. Shift spatial coordinates. Across the Atlantic Basin, the American South, predating chemical refrigeration. Architects confronting an identical gradient of lethal heat achieved the exact thermodynamic equilibrium. Zero intelligence transfer from the Egyptian continent. They fabricated the Dogtrot architecture. Dual timber enclosures bisected by an uninhibited central pneumatic corridor. Atmospheric pressure pulled air masses on a linear vector straight through the core. They engineered elevated vertical clearances. Stacked fenestrations. The rising thermal energy possessed a high-altitude reservoir to occupy. On the optimized iterations of these structures, they mounted a cupola, a ventilated mechanical turret positioned at the exact apex of the structural ridge. Its sole physical mandate: extract the highest temperature atmospheric mass from the absolute peak. Shift spatial coordinates to the Pacific Basin. Rural Japan. Agrarian entities engineered the Minka and Gasso Zukuri structures. Extreme vertical pitch. High-angle roofing. Select structures remain structurally viable after 300 solar cycles. The architecture ascends to an aggressive vertex. The spatial void directly beneath the ridge beam was intentionally unsealed. The thermal energy and carbon particulate of the interior metabolic activities ascended the vertical column, slipped through the calculated voids at the peak. Simultaneously, the hyperextended eaves blocked direct solar radiation from the vertical bulkheads. Isolated landmass. Isolated linguistic syntax. Isolated temporal epoch. Identical biomechanical instinct. Vector the thermal energy upward. Mandate its expulsion. Three distinct biological civilizations. Separated by oceanic expanses. Separated by millennia. All converging on a singular, incontrovertible physical law. Zero cross-contamination of data. An architectural envelope must exhaust its thermal load from the superior axis. Failure to do so initiates the thermal breakdown of the biological entities sealed within. And then the North American sector deleted the data. The absolute millisecond we synthesized a capital-intensive mechanical substitute, we abandoned the structural solution. The respiratory roof, a thermodynamic protocol that survived 3,000 solar cycles, hermetically sealed, eradicated within a single generational turnover. The biological entities that refused the deletion were localized collectives identical to Hochstedler. Entities that rejected integration with the centralized electrical grid. However, the thermodynamic data stored in that agrarian attic only achieved maximum lethality when an erased American manufacturing syndicate compressed the respiratory protocol into a 30 mm radius. a component you can secure in your biological manipulator, which vectors us directly to the $12 mechanical trigger. The origin of this mechanical anomaly is the Spencer Thermostat Company, the early 20th century, an engineering syndicate isolating a specific kinetic reaction. They stamped a rudimentary disc, 30 millimeters in diameter, two dissimilar metallic elements, permanently bonded at the molecular level. Because the two metals possess vastly divergent rates of thermal expansion, the disk exists under severe mechanical tension. At one precise mathematically defined thermal threshold, a kinetic violence occurs. It inverts. It snaps instantly from a convex geometry to a concave geometry. The kinetic energy mimics the acoustic fracture of a pressurized glass seal. That microsecond of kinetic inversion bridges or severs an electrical circuit. In 1931, this kinetic mechanism was absorbed by the Metals and Controls Corporation. The component was weaponized under the nomenclature Clixon. For 8 decades, it operated as the invisible, autonomous neurological failsafe inside high-velocity turbines, aeronautical thrusters, and combustion furnaces. It dictates binary electrical flow at exact thermal parameters. It extracts zero external voltage to perform this calculation. This is the exact biomechanical override for your architectural void. The bimetallic switch possesses pure autonomy. It is purely mechanical. You wire it in a strict linear sequence. A localized photovoltaic cell. A low-voltage direct current impeller. You integrate a bimetallic disc calibrated to exactly 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Below that thermal threshold, the circuit is physically severed. Total mechanical silence. The exact millisecond your architectural void reaches 90 degrees, the disk undergoes kinetic inversion. The circuit fuses. The impeller activates on pure, unmetered solar radiation. It forcefully extracts the trapped thermal mass through the apex of the structure. When the void's ambient temperature drops back below the threshold, the metal cools. Kinetic inversion returns. The circuit severs. The impeller terminates. Zero tether to your localized electrical grid. Zero interior atmospheric sensors. Zero monthly capital extraction. A century-old aeronautical failsafe, engineered to prevent heavy machinery from structural thermal cascade, now actively preventing your habitat from structural thermal cascade. For $12. The clinical reality is infuriating. None of this is theoretical extrapolation. The bimetallic disc currently dictates the thermal limits of 10 million domestic appliances. The respiratory architectural envelope is 3,000 years verified. The intersection of these two variables is globally absent in the exact location that would maximize your capital retention. But the switch is merely the neurological trigger. The impeller is merely the muscle. To map the capital retention, you must comprehend the underlying thermodynamics, 3 vectors of physics, aligning symmetrically in a single direction. Vector 1. The stack effect. Thermal expansion dictates gas density. High-temperature gas possesses lower mass. It ascends. Perforate your architectural envelope at the highest vertical elevation. Perforate a corresponding void at the lowest vertical elevation. The ascending thermal mass forcibly vacuums cold, dense atmospheric gas through the lower intake. Pure fluid dynamics. A masonry chimney functions via this exact thermodynamic gradient. Zero mechanical acceleration required. Your structural void, correctly perforated, becomes a thermal exhaust stack. The Egyptian Malkoff mechanism. 3,000 years unbroken. A clear continuous ridge vent executes this protocol continually. For free. Every solar cycle. The thermal variance is absolute. A hermetically sealed architectural void under heavy solar bombardment operates 40 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than the ambient atmospheric temperature. A 95-degree exterior equates to a 150-degree interior static oven. A respiratory void, maintaining balanced pneumatic intake and exhaust, stabilizes within 10 to 20 degrees of the ambient exterior. That specific delta, the 40 degrees of kinetic energy erased from the apex of your structure, is the total thermodynamic equation. Every singular degree in that delta is thermal radiation absorbed by your sealing matrix. Energy your mechanical compressor must forcibly extract. Room by room. Cycle by cycle. Vector 2. Thermal bridging. The structural mechanism sustaining your nocturnal hyperthermia. Heat does not strictly occupy the gaseous state. It conducts via the solid cellular lattice of your timber framing. Analyze a cast iron crucible. The primary basin reaches blistering thermal limits. The handle remains tactile for precise seconds. Then, the kinetic energy traverses the molecular lattice. It induces dermal burns. The structural rafters supporting your roofing membrane are the handle. Solar radiation saturates the exterior membrane. The thermal energy cascades down the timber scaffolding, directly into your localized ceiling. The fiberglass insulation density is irrelevant. The timber itself is the transmission vector. This dictates why the upper habitation zone peaks at midnight. The timber scaffolding has been downloading thermal radiation for 14 hours. The agrarian countermeasure, the second layer of the system, a radiant barrier. You deploy a highly reflective micrometallic membrane across the superior face of the rafters. High albedo surface targeting the hot roof deck. Radiant thermal waves strike the membrane. 95% of the infrared spectrum is violently rejected. An optical reflection of heat. This specific membrane shields extra-atmospheric vehicles. It stabilizes the core temperature of ultra-endurance athletes in critical metabolic distress. A micromillimeter film doing the brutal work of hyperdense insulation. Combine the optical rejection with the pneumatic exhaust stack. The thermal invasion is terminated at the perimeter. Vector 3. The thermal battery. It discharges during your metabolic sleep cycle. A sealed attic operates as a thermal accumulator. The timber mass absorbs infrared radiation until solar dusk. It sequentially releases this radiation into your living space. This dictates why 23:00 hours feels vastly more oppressive than 14:00 hours. A respiratory void drains the accumulator. Ambient nocturnal temperatures plummet. The stack effect vacuums the dense, cold atmospheric gas across the internal timber surfaces. It forcefully vents the stored kinetic energy. The impeller remains dormant. By the initiation of your sleep cycle, the thermal accumulator is void. Instead of microwaving your biological form through the mattress, the architecture performs its most critical stabilization in total darkness. For zero capital, now, the third variable, the failure matrix. The specific error that renders mechanical exhaust useless and terminates human compliance. An impeller displaces gas. It cannot synthesize matter. Expelled volume demands replacement volume. If the lower intake vents along your structural eaves are uninhibited, the impeller extracts dense external air. Thermodynamic balance. However, on the overwhelming majority of structures exceeding 20 solar cycles, those intakes are suffocated. Packed with displaced fiberglass particulates installed by previous occupants. When the impeller activates against a suffocated intake, it seeks the lowest pressure gradient. It vacuums the interior habitation zone. It extracts your chemically refrigerated, hyper-expensive air mass through every drywall fissure and recessed lighting canister. It ejects it into the exosphere. You installed an impeller to cool the structure. You successfully engineered a localized vacuum that actively bleeds your capital into the atmosphere. Human entities observe their energy expenditure spike. They classify the thermodynamic principle as fraudulent. They terminate the protocol. The mechanical impeller was never the failure point. The suffocated intake was the failure point. Fluid dynamics mandate balance. Balance the pressure gradient, and the impeller neutralizes its own capital cost within one solar rotation. Fail the gradient, and it drains your resources. The structural void is a singular lever. Identifying the optimal lever requires a rigid diagnostic of your specific localized coordinates, solar exposure, and structural geometry. A compiled diagnostic matrix dictates every thermodynamic alternative. It aligns them to your exact structural constraints. It exists strictly to maximize your capital retention. Examine the clinical data. Subject Wendell, a retired mechanical machinist. Coordinates: Paducah, Kentucky. Ambient external, 95 degrees Fahrenheit. He penetrated his structural void. He deployed a thermal sensor, 151 degrees static. He dedicated one solar cycle. He evacuated the soffit obstructions. He integrated a bimetallic photovoltaic impeller. He hermetically sealed the attic access port. Subsequent 95-degree exterior peak. Internal void stabilized at 107 degrees. Capital expenditure for August, reduced from $410 to $238, $172 retained in a single 30-day cycle. Material cost. Sub. $100. Subject. The Reimer Unit. Coordinates. Hutchinson, Kansas. Agrarian Mennonite Sector. Single-level structure. Linear roof geometry. They initiated the complete tripartite protocol. Intake clearance. Continuous ridge exhaust. Bimetallic photovoltaic acceleration. Rafter-mounted radiant deflection. Seasonal thermal extraction costs, benchmarked against a geometrically identical adjacent structure, reduced by 90%. 90%. Zero miraculous technology. Pure thermodynamic alignment. No variables in conflict. Subject Darlene. Coordinates. Macon, Georgia. 1970s. Masonry construction. An entire upper-level habitation zone rendered biologically uninhabitable by July. A textile workspace abandoned. Void temperature. 144 degrees. Soffit intakes. Completely asphyxiated by retrofitted fiberglass. She executed intake clearance. Single bimetallic impeller. Hatch seal. Total capital. Sub. $90. The textile workspace was reclaimed. July expenditure dropped by $140. She reported a severe drop in nocturnal acoustic disturbance. The localized compressor had ceased its infinite cycling. Subject Greg. Coordinates. Bakersfield, California. Spring equinox. He authorized a $13,800 capital injection for a hyper-efficient mechanical compressor. By August, his monthly expenditure maintained at $520. He initiated a localized thermal scan of his void. 158 degrees. Directly above his biological regeneration zones. His $13,800 machine was battling a 158-degree static oven. It was failing identically to its predecessor. He possessed zero cooling failure. He possessed an architectural respiratory failure. Zero technicians had mapped the variance. In late June of 2021, the Pacific Northwest sector encountered an atmospheric thermal dome of extreme magnitude. Portland, Oregon, a geographical zone largely lacking standardized mechanical cooling. The localized ambient spiked to 116 degrees. Absolute historical maximum. Biological entities terminated, trapped within sealed upper-level chambers, lacking thermodynamic exhaust. The structural envelopes that maintained biological viability were not equipped with maximum tonnage compressors. They were aging bungalows, equipped with high-volume void vents, cross-ventilation protocols, structures capable of dumping catastrophic thermal mass during nocturnal dips. A respiratory architecture does not rely on a centralized electrical grid currently fracturing under terminal load. It operates on fluid dynamics. Fluid dynamics never experience a localized outage. When the centralized machine fractures, the respiratory structure continues its exhaust cycle. The data is rigid. The physics are absolute. Why is this protocol not embedded in the National Architectural Code? The causation is not a centralized antagonist. The causation is a self-replicating financial ecosystem. The ecosystem extracts maximum capital when your structure fails to breathe. Analyze the financial geometry of the climatization cartel. The residential cooling sector operates on a rigid triad: distribute, maintain, replace. A centralized compressor generates infinite recurring revenue. Annual diagnostic audits. Chemical refrigerant top-offs. Complete mechanical failure and replacement every 12 to 15 solar cycles. Zero recurring revenue exists in a structural void. A bimetallic switch never requires a diagnostic technician. A continuous ridge vent never mandates a chemical recharge. A radiant membrane outlasts the structural timber. A multi-billion-dollar ecosystem orbits the mechanical compressor. Zero financial infrastructure orbits the architectural void that renders the compressor obsolete. Technicians are not programmed to analyze it. It is erased from the commercial dialogue. Analyze the degradation of architectural mandates. Historically, structural code required 1 square foot of exhaust for every 150 square feet of void. As mechanical compressors became the primary real estate marketing variable, the architectural code was silently degraded. Slashed by 50%. converted into a bureaucratic checkbox. Simultaneously, the insulation lobby dictated a singular narrative: hermetic sealing, maximize fiberglass density, suffocate the structural envelope. An industry distributing product by volume possesses zero financial incentive to construct a structure that expels thermal energy for free. When a financial appraiser scans a structure, a newly integrated centralized compressor artificially inflates the asset valuation. A balanced thermal exhaust and a bimetallic impeller remain invisible to the appraisal algorithm. They inject zero measurable resale value. Utilities and energy sectors distribute capital rebates for high-efficiency mechanical compressors. The machine is a registered product. It possesses a serial sequence. It possesses a centralized lobbying arm. Zero capital rebates exist for an architectural void and a $12 switch. The most durable, financially optimized thermodynamic correction is the exact protocol the entire financial architecture is programmed to ignore. Initiate neurological reframe. You were programmed to perceive the mechanical compressor as the apex of modern engineering. You were programmed to view the structural vent as an obsolete agrarian relic. This is a complete inversion of reality. The compressor is the primitive instrument. It requires immense kinetic force, massive electrical consumption, highly volatile mechanical components engineered for scheduled failure. It utilizes chemical refrigerants globally banned and resynthesized 3 times due to catastrophic atmospheric degradation. The respiratory structure is the apex technology. It neutralizes the thermal threat at the perimeter. Zero moving components. Zero electrical grid reliance. Zero mechanical fatigue. It utilizes a fluid dynamic principle that has required zero updates in 3,000 solar cycles. We did not scientifically evolve past the respiratory roof. We were systematically sold out of it. One hermetically sealed, hyper-dependent structure at a time. It was permitted to undergo terminal decay. Reinstating this biological defense is entirely on your coordinates. Execute these 3 protocols sequentially. First, intake activation, the foundation of fluid dynamics. Penetrate the structural void at minimum solar angle. Ling low. 0 hours. Equip localized respiratory filtration, a $5 particulate mask. Equip a high-lumen optical emitter. Traverse the perimeter where the timber meets the vertical bulkhead. Locate the soffit intakes. Operational intakes transmit external photons. Asphyxiated intakes display impacted fiberglass. Procure rigid polystyrene baffles. 10 units per $12. Mechanically retract the impacted fiberglass from every intake vector. Establish clear pneumatic channels. This localized action drops the void temperature 15 to 20 degrees. It is the singular catalyst that activates the thermodynamic sequence. Second, exhaust and neurological control. If your structure possesses gable vents, eradicate all accumulated particulate. Lacking a gable vent, utilize a reciprocating saw. Penetrate the bulkhead. Install a 16-mesh metallic insect barrier. Integrate a $15 louvered housing. Deploy the impeller. Procure a fully integrated photovoltaic exhaust unit for $200, or synthesize one for $50. A salvaged 12-volt direct current impeller, a 20-watt photovoltaic cell anchored to the high-exposure exterior. The $12 bimetallic trigger spliced into the circuit. The entire mechanism is isolated. Third, membrane deployment and leak termination. Deploy the radiant membrane across the superior rafter faces. The highly reflective layer oriented strictly toward the roof deck. Market rate, 30 cents per square foot. A standard 600 square foot architectural void requires a $180 capital injection. While inhabiting the void, hermetically seal the access port with a $7 polyurethane compression kit. The Building Research Council maps the thermal leakage. 25 to 50% of your mechanical cooling energy bleeds through interior fissures. The structural access port is the apex failure point. Seal the port. Do not seal the localized intakes. Vector the fluid dynamics. Do not suffocate them. The agrarian architects resolved the variables 100 solar cycles prior. Atmospheric moisture, kinetic gas transit vectors moisture out. A respiratory void is a dehydrated void. Precipitation ingress. A precision ridge cap integrates a mechanical baffle. It permits vertical thermal exhaust while rejecting lateral precipitation. Biological intrusion? 16 mesh metallic barriers strictly prohibit biological nesting. Bureaucratic authorization? A continuous ridge vent satisfies the architectural code across nearly all continental sectors. A photovoltaic impeller draws zero load from the centralized electrical grid. It bypasses municipal permit requirements universally. Baffles. Bimetallic impeller. Gradient membrane. Polyurethane hatch seal. Total expenditure stabilizes around $250. The neurological core of the system is $12. Tomorrow, at exactly 14:00 hours, ascend into your architectural void. Deploy a calibrated thermal sensor against the structural timber. Record the exact biometric threat level radiating into your habitation zone. You believe the machine was engineered to fight the heat. The machine was engineered to fight you.